Welcome back to Anxious Faith. I'm James Burke. As we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years looking at stories of different people's mental health and faith journeys, there are still so many facets that we haven't touched on. One of those is trauma. And the way that people who have gone through trauma suffer from that and how that plays out in their lives, kind of thing, and also can affect their faith. It can lead to all sorts of things: anxiety, depression, PTSD, flashbacks, substance abuse, all sorts of things. And we want to start having some more of these conversations as we open up the scope of what we talk about at Anxious Faith, to be looking at all of these different mental illnesses that so many people are dealing with, but so much of the time are not being able to talk about these openly, or feel they can't talk about these openly because of the guilt, because of the shame that they might be feeling, and because of the stigma that is out there. But we're excited to be joined by Dr. Mark McNear today. Mark, it's great to have you with us. Why don't you just give us a kind of 2-3 minute overview of who you are, and then we'll jump into your story a bit.
Sure, I'd be glad to, James. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I live in New Jersey. I live about an hour from New York City. I've lived here pretty much my whole life. I have been a clinician for about 30 years. I live with my wife, Debbie, who is a preschool teacher, and I am a father to my daughter, Emily, who is currently living in Wyoming with my son-in-law, Brandon.
That's fantastic. So you're a licensed clinician. I think the equivalent here in Australia would be you're a psychologist or a counsellor that works in kind of talk therapy with people. Is that kind of correct?
That's correct, yes. And so I've added on to that, being an author recently and a speaker,
Yep.
but my main job, you're right, James, is being a clinician and seeing people on a daily basis for talk therapy.
Yeah, and that's it. We are excited to be talking with you today, and yeah, we'll let people know about your book, absolutely, and where they can get a copy at the end, because that's the reason that we got in contact with you, is because of the story you tell in your book is such a raw and honest but powerful story of dealing with trauma and going through trauma, but ultimately there being some hope through the midst of that, and that hope found in Jesus as well. Let's start by, if you're happy to, telling some of your story. I think, not in chronological order, because I think the way you kind of lay it out in your book is actually a really good way for us to start thinking about things as well, and how these things can often present for people. So why don't you start with when you kind of realised there was a big problem going on?
Well, yeah, and what I would say, James, is, I didn't realize it. I was told I had a problem.
Yeah.
I called my doctor, and I was asking her for prescriptions, because I had run out and was taking way too much medication, and I had become addicted. And she was very clear, and she said to me, "You know what? You need to go to rehab because you're really abusing the medication." So, I often talk about the fact that was probably the worst day of my life and the best day of my life, because it led to tremendous freedom for me. So she told me, and so then I had to wait for my wife to come home from work, and that was not easy. I can remember sitting on the couch and just waiting for her, and so she came through the door. She teaches preschool, and so she came through the door and she said to me, "How was your day?" And I'm like thinking, "Oh, wait till you hear." So I said, I talked to the doctor, and the doctor said I should go to rehab. And Debbie is somebody that isn't fazed easily, and she wasn't, and she came over and she gave me a big hug, and she said, "We're going to get through this. I think it's wonderful that you're getting the help that you need," because she definitely saw that I needed to get the help. And, so the next thing, James, was for me to get in contact with my daughter, who was living in Florida. And so I reached out to Emily and told her, and her response again was so grace-filled, and it really gave me the encouragement to go for the help that I needed, because I remember her saying to me, "I'm so proud of you for doing this."
That's amazing. I guess to try and look a little bit more at this, so your doctors picked up on the fact that you're abusing these medications, you had taken too much of it, but you were saying you had to be told you had a problem. Did you know what was going on or why you were kind of doing this?
No, at that point, I'd like to tell you, in my profession that I saw clearly, but I didn't. I'm being honest that I didn't, and so I knew I had a problem, and I knew that I was scattering to get more and more medication, but I didn't know the backstory, so to speak, of that, and so I within the next couple of days, I called colleagues and asked them for referrals, and they said, "Oh, for who?" And I had to say, "It's
That's
for
got to be a
me."
hard one
Yeah,
to,
it's for
yeah, a
me.
hard conversation.
They thought that I was asking for clients, and I was like, "No, it's me. I have the problem." And so they gave me some referrals, and I found a place close to me, a couple hours away, in Pennsylvania. And so within a couple of days, I had sent the paperwork and was accepted into the program. And so Debbie drove me to rehab, and I can remember just feeling so discouraged and felt like, I had deceived myself. I had deceived Debbie. I had deceived Emily, friends, family, clients, and I write in the book that, most of all, I felt like I disappointed God. And I felt like at that point that he really didn't want anything to do with me. That was my feeling deep down inside. And
Yeah.
so I get to rehab and go through the process of admissions, and I am sitting there within a couple of days. I was in shock, and within a couple of days, the medication had started to go out of
Yeah.
my body. And as the medications were going out of my body, the memories of my childhood came back so strongly. And so I was dealing with the physical withdrawal from the medications, because I was taking a lot of medications, way too much. And, so I was dealing with the physical, but then I was also dealing with the emotional, pain that was coming up. And, honestly, James, there were memories that I had not thought of in probably 51 years.
Wow.
And a couple of them really took me off guard, especially with the sexual abuse, because they came back with a vengeance. And, I can remember just sitting there trying, trying to act normal in rehab with all of these guys. And they were like terrific. But, all of these memories are coming back. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, oh no, that did happen. And I have locked it away and put it away and promised that I would never, ever talk about it with anybody.
Yeah, you talked about how you'd kind of thought you'd take all of this to the grave with you, that you'd never have to confront it, never tell anyone about it.
Absolutely.
It happened to you, you've locked it away, and don't want to deal with it. So, when you were then going, and we get to rehab in the first couple of days in rehab, were you thinking you're there just for this kind of, medication, substance abuse?
It was
type
talk
therapy?
about
Yeah.
talk about the the typical denial of the addict.
Yeah.
I thought, all right, well, I'll go and I'll get it out of my system, and within a month I'll be back practicing. I'll start seeing clients again.
Yeah.
I won't tell them about it. I won't tell anybody at church. I will not tell anyone. Debbie knows, Emily knows. That's enough. Nobody else was going to know. And so, it became very evident to me about 4 or 5 weeks into it how much I needed a lot more help. And at the rehab, they had recommended that I stay for extended care, which would be a couple of more months. And I was like, no way am I doing this. I'm not doing it. It's only supposed to be a month. That was in my head.
I've got clients to get back to.
Yeah. I've got life to live,
Yeah.
And so I remember being really, really angry, just being really, really annoyed. And they had Emily, and Debbie come to the rehab.
Okay.
And so they met with me and talked with me and said, you know what, you really need to take care of yourself. And it was just a different approach, And so, I saw Emily's face, and I said, like, I got to do this. I really have to. And so again, though, there was a lot of denial and thinking like, okay, I'll go a couple more months and then I'll get out and I'll just resume life as it was. And that's not what happened. I just became so overwhelmed with the flashbacks that were coming and the memories. And not only the memories in my head, but the memories in my body. I could feel the things just coming through my body, just the energy. And, I would shut down, and then I would speed up, and I would be really, really anxious. And then I would be really, really depressed. And then I would have some dissociative features.
Wow.
And so I was in rough shape. And so, I look back at it, and I see the Lord and his hand throughout the whole process. But, it wasn't an easy process. It was a really hard process.
And it probably wouldn't have felt like at that time that God was there with you during the midst of that. So to go back a little bit then, Mark. So you are a man of faith. You're a Christian who believes. Do you want to tell us a little bit of your faith background before we get any further down your story?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So, James, I was not raised in a Christian home, or we went to church once in a while for holidays and things like that, but really it wasn't an emphasis in our home. And so when I was 19 years old, and I talk about this in the book, I got in a really bad car accident and was hit head on and ended up in the hospital. And as a result of that, I really started questioning what life was all about. And so I had picked up a book. Once I got out of the hospital, I was in the hospital for about a month, and then I picked up a book, and the book talked about going to church. It also talked about getting a Bible and underlining faith passages, and I did both of those things. And so I was going to church on a regular basis, and then they had a special Saturday night service, and they had a guest speaker, and the guest speaker spoke on going the second mile. And I can remember after he spoke, he invited anyone that wanted to go forward to accept Christ as their Savior. And I'll be honest with you, I knew a little bit about what I was doing, but God knew a lot more about it. So, I went forward, and then, really felt the call into ministry. And so shortly after that, I went to Bible college. I was going to be a pastor. And then my third year, I was having a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression, so I started counseling at that time. And it was so helpful to me that I decided that I wanted to go and to be a counselor. And so that's how some of that started. Yeah.
And I think that's an equally important part of your story as well, because so often we think that these kind of things that someone might go through, if you only knew what to look out for, you'd be able to spot the signs, and these things wouldn't happen to us, kind of thing. But here is yourself, someone who is a trained clinician, someone who has been to Bible college as well, kind of thing, yet not immune from the effects of both trauma in our past, but even when we don't know that that's what's causing it, the anxiety, the depression that's coming up and dealing with things in our lives. And as much as we want to educate people, education isn't the magic bullet that's going to fix everything, and then no one's going to have to deal with things. It's so. How is it? You said that when you kind of went into rehab, that one of the biggest things you're feeling was that you disappointed other people, but also that you disappointed God. Are you happy to talk a bit about that? Like why you were feeling that way, that you disappointed God and God wanted nothing to do with you?
I think that, I took a look at my life and knew that I wasn't living according to my values. And so, I look at it now, and I look at the fact that in so many ways my dad rejected me. And so I guess, looking back at that ride to rehab, I guess it was the same thought, like, if God, really looked at my life, how wouldn't he reject me too? Because I was used to that rejection.
And even though we know in our heads that, all the verses that say that, he has come for all and his grace is sufficient and he's not going to leave us. In the midst of that, it certainly doesn't feel like that, does it?
No, absolutely not. And, I don't know how many times I read, through that he loves us with an everlasting love. But, since I've gone through recovery, that verse has come alive to me, in Jeremiah, that, he does love me with an everlasting love. Do I feel it every day? No. Do I feel it in the midst of, depression and anxiety and flashbacks? Not necessarily, but I have, grown a lot in this, and that's why I wanted to write the book, because I thought it was a unique position that I was in. that I was a man that fell greatly,
Mm.
but by the grace of God, got up and am limping, but I'm doing well, and I'm not as anxious as I was,
Yeah.
certainly not as anxious as I was 10 years ago, or, 5 years ago, or even 2 years ago, so it's been a progression for me. And I wanted to tell that story.
Mm. I think that's a really important part to tell as well, that it's not like you were able to go to rehab to seek this inpatient treatment for an intense period of time, and then done and dusted, everything's fixed.
Yeah, we got it's kind of like I didn't want to get to chapter 7 in the book and say like now everything's wonderful, because
Yep.
it is wonderful, but it's also very hard.
Mm.
This is a strange story,
Yeah.
a hard story, but a very, very good story that talks about the redemption.
Mm.
The fact that God pursued me,
Mm.
and that in my brokenness, in my messiness, He showed up
Yeah.
with love and grace and hope and
Mm.
mercy. And so I just wanted to convey that. When I was sitting in rehab, it was, I'm not going to talk about any of this, but
Mm.
little by little, I wrestled with God, and He brought it to my attention that He wanted me to do it, and I was like, "There's no way I'm doing it. There is
Mm.
no way that I'm going to go through this, and I'm going to put these things down
Yeah.
for other people to read."
Mm.
And so we, see who won that wrestling match.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
very one-sided fight when it's us
yeah, it
versus
is.
God,
It
isn't it?
really is.
So let's pick your story up again a little bit more. Let's talk about some
Sure.
of that journey out and that process, because we kind of got to the point where you're almost at your lowest. You've come off the medication you were abusing. You're dealing with all the childhood trauma that is coming back up, and kind of in that place. How did your journey continue from there? How did you begin to piece things back together again?
It took time, and I want people
Mm.
to hear that it took a lot of time. And I just kind of got quote unquote stabilized,
Mm.
being off the meds in rehab and 3 months there. And I came home and I was just lost. I just like kind of wandered around the house, and I did go to individual counseling, which was
Mm.
really, really helpful. And I went to intensive outpatient treatment, which is 3 days a week
Oh
for a
wow.
couple of hours each day.
Mm.
And so that had the educational component to it. And, I got to hear other people's stories. I also started going to 12-step meetings,
Okay. Yep.
which was helpful. And then, going to church and just trying to keep myself as busy as I could. You
Mm.
know, I joke that I cleaned the garage out more times than I had in my whole life.
Yeah.
So, I just wanted to, I was so depressed, James, and I was so anxious, but I just felt like I needed to take one step in front of the other to heal.
Mm.
And I didn't know what the next step would be.
Yeah.
So I went to IOP for a year,
Mm.
and then I was in individual counseling. And then, it's funny to see how the Lord just brought things step by
Mm.
step by step. And Debbie, my wife, talks about that, how she saw like, one door would open
Mm.
and then one behind it would close, or one would close and then one would open. And so I did well with doing the
Mm.
12 step and doing IOP and then individual counseling. And I just like opened up a little bit in the individual counseling about a few
Yeah.
things, but not much. And so
Okay.
I was healing and exercising and doing things that I had not done my whole life,
Mm.
and started really self-care, really taking care of myself and working on that. And I didn't work for 2 years. I took 2 years
Okay.
off. Debbie and I agreed that that would be best because I was in really
Mm.
bad shape. I really
Yeah.
was. And so I got in touch with a ministry. It's Pure Desire Ministries in the States,
Mm.
and it is for sexual addiction and sexual brokenness. And
Mm.
so I had a clinician there, and his name is Harry Flanagan. And I took some tests with him, some
Mhm.
psychological testing,
Yep.
and it blew up as far as how much trauma, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think it was the first or second time that I met with him.
Mm.
He asked me to write down or to type up on a Word document
Mm.
the traumas that I had experienced.
Mm.
And so that was not something that I wanted to do at all, but I did it, and as I did that, James, a lot of other memories came out.
Yeah.
And so I sat with him for just hours talking about my story, and he didn't push me. He was very trauma informed.
Yep.
And so he allowed me to go at my speed, which was really, really helpful for me. And so it was, again, though, I look back at it and I felt like the Lord was guiding and directing me, but it was a hard journey. And all of the physical sensations that I felt in my body, I would get dizzy and I would have panic attacks and things like that. And, I just had in my mind to keep going, keep going. And so I did, and I went to more 12-step meetings and things like that, and just really cared for myself well. Worked on my marriage, worked on my relationship with my daughter Emily and with my son-in-law Brandon. And so that was really important. I went on medication for depression and anxiety, medications that weren't addictive. And so, I really wanted to take a holistic approach, and be able to attack it, in all of the different areas that I knew that I would recommend for other clients, and so it's really paid off because I really have really good days now. But it took time, and I want people to hear that. One of the stories that I talk about in the book is when I was, and I think this had such impact on the beginning of my life. When I was 4 years old, my dad force-fed me carrots, and I ended up getting really emotional and crying and ended up vomiting. And then he became irate and picked me up and threw me into the garbage and said, "Stay there, you're a piece of garbage, that's where you belong." And so, we carry those things with us. Coming to Jesus doesn't mean that all of those things just dissipate, that they disappear. And I can remember one day taking a bath, and just like, there was a realization of how much, I had harmed, and how much I had hurt Debbie, and how much I had hurt Emily. And I can remember I just started crying. And I can remember thinking, God, you're never going to throw me away. And I didn't even put it together until after I said it out loud. So trauma is something that, I talk about it in the book, that the past is not the past when it shows up in the present. And with that carrot story, fast forward, James, that's at 4 years of age. And then fast forward to 28 years old, I'm at a wedding with Debbie, and we're eating, and there's carrots on the plate, and I don't even think about it. And I stab in, and I take a bite, and I gag immediately.
Wow.
So the body really does remember.
Yeah, the body has that learned response.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I wanted to write about the fact that, I needed to find my words and then speak my words. And then I needed to embrace the words that I had, experienced those situations. And I'm still doing that. Yeah,
that's fantastic. And I think that's it, for so long, if you can't put into words what it is, you can't begin to actually realize what you have to process or heal from if you can't even identify what it is, or put into words, find your words to say what it is you went through. I want to ask a bit more, and perhaps get you to talk a bit more about this whole concept of the past is not the past when it comes up in the present kind of thing, because I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, that yes, things and trauma happens in the past, but the way it affects us in the present when it comes back up again can actually be different and even more significant sometimes.
Yeah, I have told this story that Debbie and I had bought our first house with garage doors. electric garage doors. And so when I was a child and my dad would come home, the garage door would go up. And that, to me, meant that there was danger. And so my body would tighten and my heart would pound. And I didn't even realize it then. Looking back, I do now, but I didn't realize it. So Debbie and I get married and we have this house. And so Debbie's teaching and she gets home from school and the garage door goes up and my body tightens and my heart begins to pound and I get scared and then I feel shame and then I feel guilt because why should I feel this way about my wife coming home? And so that's an example, I think, of the past is not the past when it shows up in the present. And, we talk about triggers that, when you've had a lot of trauma, there's a lot of triggers that you experience through the day.
How did you, and I guess this is, every person in the way they go through counseling, treatment to deal with it, the trauma is going to be different. But I'm guessing there's a part of your journey where you have to learn to be able to deal with those triggers in a bit more of a different way, so that you're not just always having that response.
Yeah, and I think that with the complex trauma that I had, I needed to balance it with self-care and self-soothing, and so I would get knocked, with a trigger and then, be really emotionally dysregulated and really struggle for a day or two or three, or 4 or 5. And so, a lot of the counseling that I did had to do with, self-soothing, ways to regulate the body. And so learning to walk, for a mile a day, learning to do coloring, with colored pencils, learning to do tapping, learning to do breathing. Every morning I take, I have get up, and take a hot bath. That's something that helps my body to relax. And so, that's something, James, that I talk about with clients that I work with now, kind of building a toolbox because everybody's different. Yep. Another thing is silly putty or putty that you can play with your hands helps relax the body, and so it's different for everybody. But that's a challenge that I give people that I've had myself. What types of things help me to self-soothe, to emotionally regulate? Because one of the things that we see with complex trauma is a lot of emotional dysregulation, a lot of mood, disturbance. And so, I had to work on that. And I had rituals in the morning and had rituals in the afternoon and, in the evening to help with that. And now, I still do them, but the emotional dysregulation has gotten much, much better.
That's a testament to not just how far you've come, but also your willingness to put in the work to get to that point, because it's one of those things that, you do still actively have to work at your own healing and recovering. It's not necessarily something that you can just hope will happen to you. It is a journey.
Yeah, and another thing that was really helpful to me is finding safe people that I could be around, that I could talk to about the struggles that I was having without hearing things like, well, the past, it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that shouldn't bother you now. Or, people using scripture, as kind of a way to be like, what's the matter with you? And I really didn't need that. I needed people who came alongside of me very gently, and there's a verse that has become one of my life verses. It's Romans 2:4. It's the kindness of God that leads to repentance, or it's the kindness of God that leads to change. And that's been so important for me to bring kindness to myself and to my story, and for other people to be able to come alongside me, the one and others, but to really come by and if I'm anxious, they don't, tell me I shouldn't be anxious, but they say it totally makes sense with what you've been through.
Yeah.
And that I don't know what it is about that, but just the way God has created us, it just helps my body to relax when I hear things like that from people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really huge, important thing. And I'll come back to that a bit later about perhaps, from some of your learnings, how we can better become safe people for other people. But let's talk a little bit about that vulnerability and how you learned that you actually had to be vulnerable and open and begin to share what you had gone through, rather than it just being, I am the professional with my professional face.
Yes,
and
this
is
is
how
so
everyone sees me.
if James, if you would have told me 10 years ago that I would be sitting here talking to you about this stuff, I would have been like, there is no way, James. There's no way. And so, it's something that I've learned how to do, and I still have to keep working at it.
Yep.
But I think that it really helps us to connect with others when we're able to share our burdens with one another. And, with safe people who are not rolling their eyes or sighing or, quoting scripture. There's a place and a time for that, but there's also, to mourn with those who mourn, or lament with those who are sad. And so I think that as I've been able to open up and as I've been able to talk with safe people, I have felt a lot of healing in that. And, I think that I was talking to my pastor about this yesterday at lunch, just the idea that a lot of times we share, one step and we share one thing. Yeah. And we see whether the person can receive that and whether they're going to be safe or whether we're going to receive a judgment or rejection or something like that. And if we don't, then we take another step. And it's something that's a process. It's not something where you jump and just start talking to people about your story, and so that was my, progression as far as healing, to be able to talk about little things and then talk about something a little bit, and then I was able to talk about, the physical abuse, and then I was able to talk about the sexual abuse and talk about the sexual abuse in more detail and talk about some of the emotional abuse and then some of the verbal abuse, and just how that impacted me and how it does impact me today.
Yeah, that's it. And finding those people then takes away that sting of feeling like no one knows what's going on, that there's something wrong with me, because they haven't had this experience. They don't know what's going on. I couldn't possibly tell them about it, but actually starting to take those steps and finding those safe people where you can. Yeah, over time, you're never going to start with, hey, this is everything that happened to me.
Yeah, here you go. Yeah.
It's the fastest way to lose friends, probably.
Yeah.
But yeah, having those safe people then does allow you that space to begin to journey, begin to unpack, and to have the places where you can begin to open up. Because, bottling it up obviously doesn't help, and denying it doesn't help. And in your situation, trying to numb yourself with medications didn't help either. Like, it might have helped temporarily or for
exactly.
a short term.
Yeah, but I wouldn't recommend it for the long term.
Exactly. And ultimately it didn't prevent you from having to go through all of that coming back up again either. Well.
Right.
You talked about in your recovery about how one of the amazing things is about how God showed up in the mess for you. You happy to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think that James felt so lost when I was told, that I was going to go to rehab, and I felt like I had, wrecked my marriage. I felt like I had, I was not the father that I should have been. And so, I really was a really, really, really broken individual. And so I was just, hoping to get through rehab, and God showed up in different ways with different people. And I talk about in the book a friend of mine who I was able to, Christian guy, was able to share with him just a little bit of my story. And he is in my room in rehab, and we connected.
Mm.
And he kind of made a face with some of the things that I, of surprise, kind of like, you're kidding, but he didn't move away.
Mm.
And that's how I saw God show up in ways like that. I'm still really good friends with him. I talk to him every week. And I've been able to share my story.
Yeah.
He was one of those guys, James, that I would share a little bit, and then I'd share a little bit more about the sexual abuse, and then talk about the details, and so I think that for me, there have been so many people that have been so instrumental in helping me, and that's one of the ways that I see that God has shown up for me. And just like I said, that Debbie is reminds me all the time. I cannot believe how God has showed up step by step by step, and me being in one type of counseling, and then that counseling stopping, and then something else, another door opened up, and something else that I started doing, that just took me further along in my healing, and so a lot of the counselors that I had really encouraged me to write the book, because it's such, there's so many strange stories in it. I talk about the fact that my dad came from the Depression, and that he was a self-made millionaire, a multimillionaire, and he strange behaviors. He would stand at the kitchen sink, and he would put washer detergent in there, and then he would pour in $100 bills and then wash them.
Wow.
And then take them out, and he would iron them and then staple them together, in packs of $1,000, and then he would pack it in a metal box until there was $100,000 in the box.
Wow.
And then it would be hidden in one of the cabinets in the living room. Just strange things that happened. And I wanted to just put it out there and say, like, here's this guy that was really traumatized and was really addicted, and he got through it, and by the grace of God is living a really good life now. It's not an easy life, but it's a really good life. Sometimes it's funny that Debbie and I will look at each other. We'll be in the car, we'll kind of look at each other, and we'll start laughing, and we know what both of us are thinking, like, how did we get this far? And it's only been through the grace of God that's happened. But it's a really, like I said, it's a really hard story, but it's a really good story. And I wanted to share it with people.
How did you, was there a moment, and it's okay if there's not, was there a moment where you finally were able to make that connection in your mind from going, God doesn't want anything to do with me, I've disappointed God, to then realizing that, well, no, actually he is going to continue to accept me? And
when I got out of rehab, I started listening to podcasts and started watching YouTube videos, and started reading books, and I would go to the bookstore, and it was amazing that everywhere I turned, it talked about God's grace, and it talked about the kindness of God. And I kept wanting to beat myself up, and he kept showing up in different ways, and I just read book after book about God's grace, and just so many accounts, so many different people talking about the prodigal son. And there, I was a prodigal. There's no doubt about it. And he showed up with grace and mercy and kindness, and threw a party for me. And I'm amazed every day. There's different times in the day where I'll just stop in between seeing clients, and I'll be like, how did I get here? From where I was. And so I just wanted to put that down. And the exciting thing is he's like still showing up, and still showing up with that kindness, because I am still so broken, and I still limp every day. And I didn't want to write a book and say, I went to rehab and got out and everything was wonderful because
Yep.
no, I wanted to say, as a follower of Christ, as somebody who follows the gospel, I struggle with depression at times. I struggle with mood shifts, dysregulated moods. I struggle with anxiety. I struggle with flashbacks. I struggle with discouragement. But he shows up in all of that. I thought that I needed to clean my whole act up and, be able to come to him presentable. But that's not how it works. And that's not the gospel. But that's, I think that's our default, that we want to do that. And so this has been like an exciting journey for me to be able to say, like, you know what, I can show up every day and know that he's going to be there, no matter how I'm doing.
And that's it. I can show up as I am rather than as a put together finished product. And
whatever that looks like. Exactly.
I mean, like you said, it's not the healthy that need the doctor. It's those who are sick that need the doctor.
And I think about, my real ministry now has been, as I mentioned to you, counseling, and I think about 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 3 and 4, how it talks about, God shows up in our distress and comes alongside of us so that we can do that for others. And that's what I have found to be my real ministry, where people come in and they're struggling with addictions, or they're struggling with trauma, they're struggling with abuse, shame, guilt, depression, anxiety. And it is just like a privilege for me to be able to help walk through that with them.
That's fantastic. I think one of the things I want to, not just to share your story, but also to pitch off the back of your expertise a little bit as well, but also, and just to, I think for people that have heard your story and, such a horrific story as it is, and we've only even just looked at this very brief glimpse overview of what you've been through kind of thing. I think for a lot of people, trauma is going to happen, whether it is kind of that extreme or whether it's a lot smaller in their lives as well. But how, from both your personal experience then as well, from your journey, but also as a clinician, how do people go about starting to begin to understand their trauma and recover from it, or work out what to do next?
I think that one of the things that I've seen is, and I want to preface it by saying it takes time, and it takes a lot longer than you think it takes, so whatever you're thinking, it's going to take longer, but it's definitely worth it. I think if you can find even one person that you can begin to talk to, that you feel is safe, that's going to keep things confidential, that you can begin to talk to about some of these things, really, really helpful. The one another's in scripture, bear one another's burdens in Galatians, just those principles. Confess your sins. James talks about confess your sins to one another that you may be healed. Finding somebody that you can just begin to talk to about some of these things, somebody that's going to keep things confidential. I think about in my journey, James, when I was sitting after rehab and I was sitting on that same couch that I called the psychiatrist, and, she told me to go to rehab, I was watching YouTube videos and I came across Josh McDowell's testimony, and he talked about being sexually abused, talking about domestic violence in his home, talking about real struggles with anger, and, him coming to know Christ. And, toward the end of the video of his testimony, he shares, find somebody to talk to. And I've already told you that I wrestle and that I'm not too cooperative. And so, I heard that. And so I started all over again, figured, I'll listen to it again, see if it has a different ending. And I think I listened to it, I think I ended up listening to it like 5 or 6 times.
Wow.
And he talked about the same thing. Find somebody that you can talk to. Maybe somebody that's had a journey like, like you're starting, somebody that's had problems with addictions, or somebody that's had problems with abuse, somebody that's further along in their journey, and just talk with them. Another thing, I sat at 12-step meetings hearing stories, and I wasn't going to open up and start talking about my stories. I just wasn't emotionally ready for that. I didn't do it in rehab, and I wasn't ready to do it in 12-step groups, but I sat and I listened to other stories, and it was really beneficial for me to be able to hear other people's stories and hear how they progressed in their healing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I guess then for those of us that perhaps aren't or haven't gone through trauma, but if we're in, a faith community, we want to be those one another's for other people. We want to be the kind of person that can, bear each other's burdens, that can confess the sins to each other, as we're told to do. So how do we go about being a safe person for someone to open up to?
Yeah, and I want to just step back for a minute. You talk about trauma. I don't think a lot of people. I think there's a lot of people that have been through complex trauma. My story is extreme, but I think all of us from Genesis chapter 3 on have been wounded. And really the Greek word trauma is translated as wound.
Yeah.
So we've all been wounded. We know what it's like to be rejected. We know what it's like to feel insecure. We know what it's like to feel disappointed, and so, I think that we can only take people, and I'm taking this from Dr. Dan Allender, we can only take people as far as we've come ourselves. So I think that we all need to look at it like we're on this journey of healing emotionally, because the fall wreaked havoc in our lives, in all areas of our lives, and so just being open and asking yourself, how would I want to be treated if I was in that situation? And I have been unbelievably blessed by so many people who have come alongside of me, and again, have not rolled their eyes, have not sighed, have not crossed their arms, have not started quoting scripture at me. A lot of times people want to come and confess their sins. They don't want to hear how wrong they are. They already know.
Yeah.
And so, I think about Galatians chapter 6. Paul writes in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, if somebody is taken in a sin, or somebody is found out to be sinning, restore that person gently, lest ye fall, or lest ye be tempted. And then it goes on to say, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. I think when somebody comes to us and they want to confess something to us, it's like we're on holy ground, we're on sacred ground, and we need to, if we're capable of doing it, hear it, and then help them to find, the counseling they need. Or the 12-step group they need. We don't have all the answers. I let clients know every day, I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to be here with you, and I'm not going to leave the room. There's something just about connecting with others and letting them know, that I'm here for you, that is just healing in and of itself.
And one of the things I love about that verse, and I think, for me personally, what I take as one of those key words in Galatians 1 is gently.
Yeah.
We're not to do it in a way that is accusatory or judging or anything like that. We are to gently restore them. So much can be summed up in that word, and change the way we approach it to be someone that is safe rather than someone that is either indifferent or, perhaps
because we're all one step away from it, whatever that sin is, if we're realistic with it. And so I think that, if people are listening tonight or today, they can just listen, to the voice of God and ask him, how would you have me handle somebody? And let God guide them.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, the little bits you have. For people that want to hear more of your story and to learn a bit more about both what you've been through, but also your journey and what you've learned out of that, why don't you tell us a bit about your book that you've written and how people can get a copy of that?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So the book is called Finding My Words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. and they can go on Google. If they just Google Mark McNear, MARKMCNEAR, and then just put in Finding My Words, you know, the Amazon page will come up. But also there's a lot of articles that I've written, and there's a lot of different podcasts that I've done, and so they'll come up. You know, if they want to get in touch with me, they can just again Google markmcnear.com and get to my website. And when they get to my website, there's a place to contact me, and so they can email me, and I'll be glad to answer them.
Fantastic, and we'll have links to those in the show notes below. But Mark, thank you so much for your openness, for your honesty, for your courage, both in telling your story in the first place, but also in sharing it with us today.
Thanks, James. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. If it was helpful or encouraging, we'd love for you to drop a like on this video, share it around. You can see way more content on our website at anxiousfaith.org, where you can listen to each episode of the podcast, find resources, and read our blog around mental health and faith. Be sure to also follow us on socials via the links in the description, and subscribe to our channel so you can be kept in the loop when we're dropping more content for you. Thanks so much, and God bless.